there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. One man, one microphone, one mission, one message. True News, the only newscast reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And now for the most powerful hour on radio, here is End Time Newsman, Rick Wiles.
This is a special edition of True News. I'm Rick Wiles. I'm going to present to you two interviews from our archives of past interviews, and I believe these two interviews are going to help you understand things that are happening in the USA and the world right now. In my first interview, I will be with Dr. Scott Lively. He is the author of the book, The Pink Swastika. And as you listen to this interview, I want you to think about the rise of a totalitarian government, a Nazi regime inside the USA right now, and the simultaneous rise of homosexual power in America. The second interview will be with G. Edward Griffin, the author of the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And as you listen to this interview, I think you'll understand who is really carrying out the biggest bank robbery of wealth in the history of the world, the U.S. Federal Reserve. Here are the two interviews. One of the most fascinating books in my personal library is The Pink Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party. You want to talk about a politically incorrect book? Well, this is it. The left-wing activists in the news media don't want you to know that the Nazi Party was officially the National Socialist Party. They weren't right-wingers. They were far left-wingers. And the socialists and their apologists in the news media also don't want you to know about how deeply the Nazi Party was infested with occultism and homosexuality, two things that appear before a nation implodes. Well, The Pink Swastika was published in 1995. I think I bought my first copy, I'm thinking sometime maybe the year 2000. We started the program in 1999, so it was sometime in that period. And it was an eye-opener for me. And I remember clearly when the Holy Spirit gave me a reading list. It wasn't by the books, but it was by topics. And I was in prayer, and the Lord just gave me this list of topics that he wanted me to study. And one of them was Nazism. And I wrote down the whole list that I was hearing in my spirit as I was praying, and I began to search for books on those subjects, and that's how I came across The Pink Swastika. And I was shocked at what I learned about Hitler and the top Nazis, and I said, they lied to me in school and college. They never told me any of this stuff. The media has never told me any of this. All they've told us is that they were right-wingers, and they weren't right-wingers. They were gay, left-wing socialists. Imagine that. Well, the book was co-authored by Dr. Scott Lively and Kevin Abrams. And Dr. Lively is on the telephone. He is an ardent defender of the traditional family, and his website is defendthefamily.com. Dr. Lively, welcome to True News.
Oh, it's so very good to be here. I believed that the Nazis were anti-homosexual, and I was the spokesman for a ballot measure campaign in Oregon when I encountered this information for the first time. We had introduced a ballot measure that would have changed the Oregon Constitution and stopped the homosexual agenda cold. And I was the spokesman for that, the communications director for the Oregon Citizens Alliance. And the opposition campaign was based on the theme that people who oppose gay rights are like the Nazis. And that was, we were hammered with that for 2 solid years. All the media, the governor, the activists that flooded in from all over the world to oppose us. And one day, this guy came into my office, and he was sort of a wild-eyed sort of a guy, and he had this sheet of handwritten notes, and he said, "They got it all wrong. The Nazis were homosexuals." And I thought the guy was a kook, and I nodded politely and took the papers and stuck them in a file. Didn't really do anything. We went through that whole election cycle, and then in the next election cycle, we lost. We revived the campaign and a whole series of city and county initiatives. And when we got to the Marion County where we were, the opposition leader revived that campaign that people who oppose gay rights are like the Nazis. And he wrote a letter to the local newspapers saying he just returned from Dachau, what an amazing similarity there was between the OCA and the Nazis. And I said, I've had enough. I went and dug up these papers out of my files, read them for the first time, and my jaw hit the desk. Because these were direct quotations from mainstream history books, William Shirer, Conrad Hayden, and others, stuff that had been published from the 40s through the 60s, and that was the beginning of this book. And I went out and did hundreds more hours of research and compiled what's now 400 pages of documentation on this theme in the Pink Swastika, which is now in its 4th edition.
Okay, let's start with the Fuhrer himself. Did he have sexual identity problems?
Well, Hitler was what I would call a pansexualist. He wasn't exclusively a homosexual, not in the sense of just being attracted to people of the same sex. There are at least 4 women that we know of that he had sex with. It was a very perverted form of sexuality. All 4 of them tried to commit suicide. 2 of them succeeded. It seems that his primary emphasis was extreme form of masochism called coprophilia, which involves human excrement. It's completely disgusting. And I think that the homosexual culture that he lived in and that homosexual relationship that he maintained with his whole inner circle was really sort of a less perverse identity than the one that he would have opted for if he'd had the chance. The person that's probably the closest to Hitler's profile in terms of sexual perversion is Alfred Kinsey, the guy that really launched the sexual revolution here in America. Mm-hmm. He was an in-the-closet gay activist, but he spent all of his time indulging himself in every kind of wickedness that you can think of. And Hitler did pretty much that as well, but there was less opportunity there in Germany.
And Kinsey, in his experiments, he actually had little children who were molested as part of his scientific experiments.
Yes. Now, some of those were actually the children of I think it was the Buchenwald concentration camp, and that the person who did those experiments, many of them, was one of the Krupps, who had a sort of a children's division of the concentration camp, and he messed with all those kids there. And people don't understand that the Kinsey Institute that exists today, they've got the old German records. People don't know that the gay movement did not start here in the United States. It started in Germany in the 1860s, and it came to full fruition as a movement by the 1920s in Germany. It was the reason for the moral disintegration of that country and the rise of Nazism. And the whole inner circle of Adolf Hitler was homosexual. But this is where it gets really interesting, because Hitler's faction were masculine-oriented, butch homosexual men. And the ones that the Nazis later did persecute, there were quite a number of them, nowhere near in the millions. It was maybe the tens of thousands. But their enemies were the effeminate branch of the German gay subculture, which actually got started first. It was Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, the founder of the feminist branch of the male gay movement, that really launched the whole thing. It's one of his friends that coined the term homosexual. It didn't exist before Ulrichs' group. And he created a group called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in order to try to create a political movement to overturn the sodomy laws of Germany. And but he had a theory that all male homosexuals were really females trapped in men's bodies, and lesbians were really men trapped in female bodies, and then he called that the third sex theory. So what he was basically saying is that all homosexual men are really women, and the masculine-oriented butch homosexuals hated this guy because they were not feminine at all. They were even ultra-masculine, and so they warred. These two factions warred against each other for a long time. And then when the Nazis really formed together and wanted to pursue political control of the state, they created the Nazi Party, and almost all the early Nazis were homosexual, almost all of them, and they began going for parliamentary seats. Well, the effeminate homosexuals were aligned with the Communist Party, and they were the homosexuals among the communists were grounded in the Sex Research Institute of Berlin, which was Germany's version of the Kinsey Institute, and by this time, Ulrichs was long dead. Magnus Hirschfeld was the head of this Sex Research Institute of Berlin, which everybody that got arrested for sex crimes was sent to this institute for therapy, right? Which is being run by these effeminate homosexual men. And so what would happen, though, is that these effeminate gays affiliated with the communists, whenever there was an election and the Nazis were trying to get parliamentary seats, they would release information to the newspapers about the homosexuality of the Nazis and sabotage them. So they had this intense hatred of the femmes. And so as soon as Hitler came to power in 1933, one of the first acts of his control was to send the brown shirts over and to take over the Sex Research Institute of Berlin, to go in there, take control of the building, kick everybody out, steal all those files, which was all the incriminating evidence. That was May 6, 1933. 4 days later, May 10th, 1933, they put them all in a big giant bonfire and set it on fire. And then they were stood out there throwing Thomas Mann's books and other things in there to make it look like it was something else. But that famous image of the book burning,
mm-hmm.
That was the records of the Sex Research Institute of Berlin, and it was the assistant director of the institute that exposed that came out publicly saying the reason they're doing this is because that's all the records that show that these guys were arrested for perversion. It's amazing stuff.
They threw books in as the political cover for the giant fire.
Right.
And today, the only thing teachers and professors talk about in school and colleges is the Nazis burned books.
Yes, that's it. It's amazing deception that they engaged in this, and almost nobody knows this stuff.
Well, this explains why Hitler and the Nazis were going after the communists, because Hitler was a socialist, so why would he go to war with the communists? Well,
they called the brown shirts beefsteak, brown on the outside, red on the inside. And they actually copied, the Nazis really copied the communists in many of their tactics. It was the communists that were doing sort of, beating people up and stuff for a long time. The Bolsheviks and that's how they had taken over Russia. In fact, the first concentration camps weren't in Germany; they were in Russia, and the Nazis were basically just following the example of the model that had been set. So they were just a counter faction. They were a splinter off of the communists.
Hitler, as a young man, he was a student of Madame Blavatsky. He was deeply involved in the occult.
All this happened when he was a street kid, basically.
Mm-hmm.
He left his home. He didn't have any place to go. He was on the streets in Germany, mostly in Munich and Vienna, and he was as a street kid with no place to go. He was trying to make it as an artist, and that was the perfect recipe to sort of be swept up into gay culture. And I don't know who introduced him. That isn't, he never confessed to any of this stuff or wrote about it himself. It's all sort of secondary evidence and other sources, people who are saying that they had sex with Hitler or whatever. But what we do know is that he became a male prostitute in Munich and Vienna.
Hitler was a male prostitute?
Yes. And he lived in a flop house for, that was primarily a home for street hustlers. and that's how he met many of these people, including Ernst Röhm, who was really the power behind the throne in Germany.
What took place in the 20s and early 30s?
Well, the beginning of the Butch faction was in 1902. Hans Bleuer formed the Gemeinschaft der Eigenen, the community of the elite, and they were sort of chafing against this characterization of male homosexuals as women, and so they created this separate identity. They reached back to ancient Greek culture, specifically the Spartans, for a sort of model to follow, and then they began promoting this sort of hyper-masculine form of homosexuality throughout Germany. They gained control of the German Wandervogel movement, which is like the German version of the Boy Scouts, and by 1912 they were in complete control of that.
But that's what they're doing here, Dr. Lively. That's what they're doing in America. They're infiltrating the Boy Scouts.
Yeah, they're trying to. They've resisted it pretty much here, but in Germany they were completely taken over. In fact, a group had to split off away from them in order to have a separate form of Boy Scouts that wasn't under homosexual control. But the real important fact here is that what they were doing was inculcating in these children the philosophy of the Männerbund, the all-male society. That's where it was in the Wandervogel that their greeting that they had was the Sieg Heil salute. This wasn't invented later by the Nazis. This came out of that homosexual pederast culture in the early teens. And actually, the concept of the Führer also. The Führer doesn't just mean leader. It means it's like a religious figure that deserves all respect. And that concept of Führer came out of that same group as well. And it had huge, huge influence. We don't know if Hitler was a member or not, but he clearly was steeped in that same way of thinking. Now, it's these young men that actually came of age just in time to fight in World War I, and they were the ones that really became what was known as the stormtroopers. And they called them that because they would sort of jump up out of the trenches on their side, and in this lightning strike, they would storm across the battlefield and jump into the trenches of the enemy, the Allies, in these daring raids. And because they had this sort of warrior ethos that they had adopted based on the Spartan model. And it was these young men that really became known as the stormtroopers. And they were it really starts to take shape in terms and look like what we would recognize today as Nazis. At the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles imposed on Germany it can only have 100,000 men in arms. So the nationalists all keep their guys all organized in these non-military hierarchical structures, sports teams and things like that were called Freikorps or Free Corps. And they were all organized under the leadership of the former junior officers of the army. Well, one of those Freikorps was called the Rossbach-Bund. It was Gerhard Rossbach's group. That's what that means, the Rossbach-Bund. Gerhard Rossbach's group. And Rossbach was the main homosexual leader leading into the creation of the Nazi Party. He was the guy who invented the brown shirts. That's his group, his Freikorps were all homosexual, and they were distinct from all the other Freikorps because he dressed his guys in brown uniforms that were left over. So he got them out of the army surplus stores because Germany had lost its African colonies during World War I. And so all these brown uniforms were now filling up these stores because they no longer owned any of these territories, and that's the color that they used in Africa. The rest of the Freikorps were still dressed in the gray uniforms of the German army. And so Rossbach was distinct from all the rest in dressing his guys in brown, and that's how they became known as the brown shirts. And so all the brown shirts at the beginning were homosexual.
Whoa. You're saying all of the Nazi brown shirts at the beginning were homosexual. That's a strong statement.
Well, that's the part that even the left will admit. I mean, that's not as cryptic and hidden as some of the rest of the information. I mean, there's lots of historians that acknowledge that. It's some of the other stuff that they will, like Ernst Röhm, for example. They can't deny that he was a homosexual because he was in the newspapers. They've got newspaper clippings of him being put on trial for molesting boys and things. But Rossbach was himself molested, or at least recruited into homosexuality by Gerhard Rossbach, and then he took over for Rossbach as the head of the Brown Shirts. And right at the time that Hitler and Rome were becoming partners in this sort of campaign to create a political movement.
I'm talking with Dr. Scott Lively, in the book, The Pink Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party. It was published in 1995. I've had a copy of it for years. The book is available. It's out there in a fourth edition now?
Fourth edition. Actually, I'd send people to WorldNet Daily. That's they're carrying the book now. I'd rather support them than Amazon.
Okay.
Or you can go through my website, defendthefamily.com. You can get it directly from me.
Yeah, okay, defendthefamily.com. Yeah, support his ministry, defendthefamily.com. Okay, did the Nazis did they seek to introduce homosexual themes into German society through propaganda in the schools and other parts of the society?
The thing about it is that Hitler knew that he would never get away with being open about his homosexuality. So what happened was that the homosexual movement had come to full power by the 20s, and it was really the effeminate branch of the movement that was associated with homosexuality. And they had corrupted Germany so severely that during the Weimar period, just before the Nazis, they had what we have under Obama, an extreme socialist theme and a disintegration of sexual morality, even worse than here today. Is they had in the cities, they had huge transvestite balls with men dressed as women and women dressed as men. They had teams of prostitutes wandering the street that included mothers and daughters and fathers and sons. Just every type of perverse taste that you had could be satisfied almost openly, and that was what the German people were rebelling against. The people didn't like this, and they wanted to return to what would seem to be a more conservative morality, and that's what Hitler came in saying that he would do. Is he had very carefully protected the impression that he was against the homosexuals.
This is really, in fact, this is a mind bender. You got to think about this. Hitler and his inner circle were gay, but the German public was rebelling against the open, effeminate homosexuality that was rampant in their society, and they ended up embracing a secret, in-the-closet homosexual who then brought in the worst fascism, the worst totalitarian dictatorship that Germany had ever seen. Okay, now, Dr. Lively, I've been saying for many, many years that the United States of America right now resembles Germany in the 30s. And I believe we are on the same path. And
I'd say we're in the 20s. I'd say we're in the 20s now.
So we're in the okay. So you think we're on the same path, but maybe we're a decade back. We're in the 20s. We're at the point. Yeah. We're at the point of the open. Weimar. Okay.
We're the Weimar culture of where Obama is working to bring in a socialist system. That's what the whole healthcare thing is and all that. The Nazis didn't embrace that kind of stuff. They were industrialists, They kept control and ownership of the industries, but they were real big on industry and people working and all of that. The Weimar culture is very much like what we have. What the Democrat Party today is very much like the Weimar culture was then. Very extremely socialistic, and amoral or immoral to an extreme. Every kind of perversion is acceptable, no limitations on that, indoctrinating the whole society in anything goes kind of sexual morality. That's different. When Hitler came along, him and his cronies were homosexual, and they were doing all their stuff in the back rooms. But on the surface, they were the moralists. And what I think what we're seeing is all the groundwork being laid for a globalist system to come in. You know, who is the Antichrist? As he's described in Revelation, the Antichrist is a man of incredible power and deception that seems to be coming in to sort of bring order. I think that the entire Bible can be viewed as prophecy, not just the books of the prophets. That there are that everything within the Bible is multidimensional. But I think the message that we're given regarding the end times is in the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It happens right after the destruction of the earth by water, by the flood, and it is said that by Jesus that as in the days of Noah, so it will be when he comes for his second coming. So he is connecting the end times to the flood. And so there's a big parallel between what happens there and what happens here. So then he puts the rainbow up in the sky after the flood as a sign that he'll never destroy the earth again with water. And we know that forever after, fire then is the symbol of his wrath. Well, what happens right after the flood? You know, you read just a couple of pages or just a couple of paragraphs even, a very short distance from the end of the flood to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire. The only place in all of Scripture where an entire collection of 4 cities completely destroyed by fire and brimstone. Why? Because of homosexual perversion. They're basically doing again what they had done before the flood. And this time God's basically showing, okay, this is what's going to happen at the end. When I bring judgment by fire, here is the example. And Jude, in the book of Jude, I think, was it 7, verse 7, talks about that Sodom was destroyed because they went after strange flesh. And it's left there as an example forever of what happens to those who reject God, that receive his wrath. Well, he also points out, it's also significant, what is the symbol of the gay movement today? It's the rainbow flag. Why? Of all things that they could choose. I believe, in a spiritual sense, that this is them thumbing their nose at God. They're holding up the flag that represents God's promise not to destroy the earth. But at the same time, they deny that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is his action against homosexuality. So they completely miss that part of the story and are walking around under the banner of gay pride in their sin. In Revelation, when it talks about the 2 witnesses, you know, after Satan kills, or Satan inhabiting the Antichrist kills the 2 witnesses, they lie in the street for 3 days, no one's allowed to bury them, in the city that is called mystically Sodom and Egypt, which is it's the city of Jerusalem.
Yes. But
it's called mystically Sodom and Egypt. Now, why would that be? I believe that not only is homosexuality central to that whole story, I think that may even be wrapped up in the whole mark of the beast. That there's something about taking that mark represents a complete repudiation of Christ. And if it is, as I think it's going to be, and I think the scenario we're seeing it unfolding before us right now, right before our eyes. I think we're going to see a collapse of the global economic system. We're going to see worldwide chaos and millions of people dying. And then I think we're going to see the Antichrist come in as a savior, being hailed as a savior, and then he's going to bring with him a new global economic system in which you can only participate if you accept the mark, a number or whatever, that allows you to be able to go down to the supply house and get your rations that otherwise you're not going to be able to get. and it's something about that. You have to sign a pledge, or you have to something that. And I think that there's going to be a homosexual element in that somehow. It's just a hunch, but I see this as so central to the whole story, and that homosexuality is presented in Scripture as being the outside edge, the extreme edge of rebellion against God that receives that's present when God exhibits His anger.
The book is The Pink Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party, co-authored by Dr. Scott Lively and Kevin Abrams. And you can order your copy at Dr. Lively's website, defendthefamily.com, defendthefamily.com. Thank you, Dr. Lively. Appreciate you coming on the program today.
It's my great pleasure. God bless you.
Reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ. This is True News.
Well, welcome back to True News. I'm Rick Wiles. One thing I quickly learned in the early days of this radio program is that there are certain topics that you are not allowed to mention or discuss on the radio or television. Topics that are simply forbidden to be discussed in an intelligent, rational manner. Some of those topics include the phrase New World Order. You also cannot talk about global government or global governance. You can't talk about Zionism, and you can't talk about the Federal Reserve Bank. Just think about it. Have you ever heard Fox News' Bill O'Reilly or CNN's Anderson Cooper talking about these topics? Or have you ever heard them ask an important guest a question about any of these topics? No. These topics are unmentionable. That's why we have alternative media outlets such as True News. We don't have a list of unmentionable topics. We ask questions. We try to find the truth. So today we're going to focus on one of those unmentionable topics, a topic that we've discussed on this program on and off for 12 years, the Federal Reserve. What is it? Who created it? Where did it come from? Is it a government agency? Who controls it? Why are we not allowed to question their policies? What did the Founding Fathers say about a central bank? Has the Federal Reserve helped or hurt the American people? What is their role in the current global financial crisis? One man who has been studying the Federal Reserve for decades is Mr. G. Edward Griffin. He published a book in 1994 entitled The Creature from Jekyll Island. I didn't discover it until I started this program in 1999. It was one of the first books I read when I started the program, when my eyes opened up and I realized that although I thought I was a highly informed person, I discovered that I was highly misinformed. My head was full of misinformation, disinformation, and it was a shocking experience. Many of you have gone through that same experience where when your eyes open up and you realize they've been lying to me all these years. It is a real shocking experience that you go through as you're being deprogrammed from the propaganda. Well, if you've never read the book, you must do so. It's a classic, and Mr. Griffin continues to update it year by year. He is on the telephone with us today to talk about the unprecedented things happening in the global economy and how it is tied to the central bankers. Edward Griffin, welcome back to True News.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
This book has had a profound impact on a lot of people. I don't know if you're aware how many people have used your book to wake up and realize the size of this this octopus that has wrapped its tentacles around the United States of America. It really has had a profound impact on me and many other people. When did you, how far back, I mean, I know the book was written in 94, but how far back did you go in terms of when did you start to become aware yourself of the sinister origins and agenda of the Federal Reserve?
I think my first rumblings and suspicions about the size of this problem occurred sometime early in the 1980s. Prior to that, I was interested in world affairs and political affairs and international affairs and all of that, but I never really focused on the monetary side of it, thinking that probably wasn't, really related. I was more concerned with the size and scope of government, the concept of what is the proper role of the state, and constitutional issues, and the money issue was just always there in the background. And so I wasn't aware of that at first. Like, as you said, so many people just ignore it, and we're not allowed to talk about it. I didn't realize that. But I did, in retrospect, I did realize that one of the reasons I didn't focus on it is because I never heard about it. Nobody discussed it on the radio or television or in the newspaper. So you're quite right on that, and I think the reason that so many of us have gone through a major portion of our lives without any particular interest in or awareness of the monetary system is because it's just not a popular topic, and we know now why it's not.
That's right.
But it never occurred to me prior to that.
If I would have been a contestant on a game show before I read your book, and the question was, Rick, for $200, what is the Federal Reserve? I would have said, well, it's an agency of the U.S. Treasury Department. It's the central bank that prints all of our money.
Yeah. Well, you would have gotten half credit for that. It is the central bank that prints all of our money or creates all of our money. But even coming up with a phrase like central bank indicates a certain awareness of this issue, because most people, myself included, before I got into this, I wouldn't have known what you meant by the word or phrase central bank.
Well, I didn't either, but I just knew. But I would have had the impression it is an agency of the Treasury Department. They work for the Secretary of the Treasury. They print the money. It's not an agency of the U.S. government.
No, the U.S. government is an agency of the Federal Reserve System.
There you go.
That's an extreme statement, but it's not so far from the truth when you really dig into the facts.
Yeah, the current regime that we have running the country is an agency of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, that's pretty close to the truth.
About a year ago, it was just late last fall, Ben Bernanke and the boys, they took a little trip down to Jekyll Island to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the meeting that you described in your book. And I said on this program, criminals always return to the scene of the crime. But, I mean, years ago they wouldn't even acknowledge Jekyll Island. Now they openly go back and celebrate. Tell us what happened on that little island off the coast of Georgia.
Well, it's quite a story, and that's the reason, of course, I titled my book after that event, The Formation of the Federal Reserve on Jekyll Island in Georgia. But I know we don't have a lot of time for all of the delicious little details, so let me just cut to the chase and say that the Federal Reserve System was created on Jekyll Island because the creators needed to have a very private and secret place to go and do this. They spent about a week creating it there. They didn't want to be in their normal habitat. They certainly didn't want newspaper reporters hanging around. They didn't want secretaries and assistants and telephone calls and all that stuff. They just wanted to be away. And the main thing is that they were creating something which they wanted to hide. And so they didn't want word of it getting out or any of the details. And it'll be clear in just a moment when I explain what they were creating. Everybody thought that the Federal Reserve System was an agency of the government, that it was supposed to be an instrument of the government to control those big bad bankers. Well, it turns out that the Federal Reserve System was actually created by those big bad bankers, and that's what they wanted to hide. If the public had known that the banks themselves created the legislation which supposedly was going to control the banks, then they could have seen the fraud right from the very beginning. So it was essential to do all of this under conditions of great secrecy. And that's why they went to Jekyll Island. And for years afterwards, these people denied that they went there. They said, oh, no, that's just a rumor. If that had been in today's vernacular, they would have said, what are you, some kind of a conspiracy theorist, something like that. And that's pretty much was the attitude, because they just didn't want that information out. Then later, of course, they admitted it and said, oh, yes, that's what we did, and weren't we wise to do so, because, the American people weren't ready for this kind of a wonderful move yet, and so forth. So that was why they went to Jekyll Island, is to conceal the fact that what was being created there was not an agency of the federal government, but it was a cartel. The biggest banks of the United States came together, the representatives came together on Jekyll Island. Formerly, they had been competitors, and ostensibly they still were competitors, but like so many industries, they decide to cartelize themselves. And so they all come together and come to an agreement by which they will limit the competition between them so that they can, preserve their profit margins and keep the little guys from coming into the inner club. And it's sort of like a shared monopoly. And that's what they created. And when they were all done, they took an eraser and erased the top of the page which said cartel agreement, and then they wrote in Federal Reserve Act. And then they took it to Congress and they passed it into law. So what we have today in the Federal Reserve Act is really the legalized cartel agreement between the largest banks of the United States, and you and I are forced to comply with it under the threat of imprisonment or fine and so forth. And that's basically the story.
What were the political and economic conditions at that time, a century ago, that set the stage for the Congress to buy this plan?
Well, there was a lot of concern among the American people about the growth of economic power in the hands of these giant banks and Wall Street firms, investment banks. See, I said that these were the largest U.S. banks, and that's true, but those banks in turn had very close interlocking relationships with the largest banks in Europe as well, with the Rothschild dynasty and with the Warburgs in Germany and the Netherlands and so forth. So this really was an international grouping, but it was the U.S. base of it. And the American people were becoming aware of this concentration of power. You, as a corporation, and you needed your bonds or your stocks to be marketed, you had to go through one of these institutions, and they had a grip on the high end of all financial transactions in America. They determined who got credit and who didn't. They had tremendous interlocking control over the largest corporations, because the corporations would take out huge loans, and the banks then would insist that in return for this loan that the board of directors include one of their bank directors. And so gradually this interlocking network grew up, and the American people were concerned about this power. And so they demanded that Congress pass a law to control and regulate this power. So the banks said, heck, the people want some kind of legislation. Okay, we'll write the legislation. We'll lead our own opposition. We'll let them think that they're getting what they want, but we'll do it. And we'll do it in such a way that it'll be to our advantage, and it won't control us at all. So that's basically what happened. It's still going on today, this sort of a game, when the public is concerned about something, then Congress goes through the motion of coming up with some legislation supposedly to solve the problem. But in retrospect, years later, you find out, well, my gosh, the legislation didn't solve the problem. The legislation favored the very groups and individuals that caused the problem. And so that's what happened with the Federal Reserve. It's what's happening in the healthcare industry. It's what's happening in the war on terror and the war on drugs, the war against crime, all of these things. If you really look at the effect of the legislation and who is behind them, it's not solving problems at all. It's institutionalizing them.
Now, when Ben Bernanke has to answer to somebody, he doesn't answer to the President of the United States or to the Congress. He answers to another bank in Basel, Switzerland, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. What is the role of BIS in this international banker scheme?
Well, there's some debate on that because, we're all on the outside. I'm sure that if we were a little mouse and could sit there in the corner of the boardroom and all of these heads of the central banks of the world go to Switzerland, we could have quite an education as to who answers to whom. But we do know that it is the overriding association, you might say, the union of all of the central banks of the world. And they do get together and they share ideas and they come to agreements. And then they take those agreements to their respective countries and they implement them. And the decisions, I think, come from the Bank of International Settlements, although there may be other more covert groupings that we are not familiar with. I suspect that some of those decisions may even come from groups like the Bilderberg Group. But when it comes down to the technicalities of, credit and exchange rates and all of that kind of thing, it certainly goes through Switzerland.
As I go down various trails, we always seem to end up with Nazism and fascism.
Well, there's a good reason for that, and that is that those old-time dictators, Hitler and Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong and those people, were really the pioneers of world collectivism. So just about everything that the modern-day collectivists are using can be traced back to those early pioneer days. I mean, these guys are really the founders of world collectivism. Hitler was very innovative, very creative, and very smart. He knew about human nature, how to manipulate public opinion, and to use emotions and loyalty and patriotism and all of those emotions and feelings that we generally consider as positive. He knew how to harness those and use them to promote his own agenda. So did Mao Zedong, and so did Stalin. So it doesn't surprise me if the modern age of financing international collectivism can be traced certainly to Hitler or one of the others as well.
At the time that the bankers pushed through the Federal Reserve legislation, they also managed to get a constitutional amendment pushed through our Congress in the states that established the income tax, and then we got the Internal Revenue Service. Is the IRS and the income tax, are these two things the creation of the same people that gave us the Federal Reserve System?
That's a very interesting fact. It is true that the very same senators and congressmen and behind-the-scenes people that were promoting the Federal Reserve Act were also behind the income tax in America. And here's exactly another example of what I was saying before. When the people wanted some kind of reform, they got something that looked like reform to them. They were told it was reform. They applauded it. They voted for it. They celebrated when they got it. And then years later, they found out it was nothing but a way of entrenching the forces that were already in control. The income tax was sponsored by people who, by any measure, would have to be considered some of the richest people in the world. And why would they want an income tax which was sold to the American people as a means of, getting it from the rich and giving it to the poor? Here's the rich people saying, let's promote this idea of take it from the rich and give it to the poor. Why were they doing that?
Why? Why were they?
Well, because they wanted to get it. They wanted to get it passed, and so they were.
No, but I mean, why did the rich want the income tax?
Well, because they knew that the income tax eventually would be a means of redistributing wealth, of taking the money from the middle class and giving it to the upper class. Because they knew that the very super rich, because of their
wait a minute. That's not the way redistribution of wealth is supposed to work. You're supposed to take it from the wealthy and give it to the poor. You're saying that the purpose of the income tax was to suck the wealth out of the middle class and take it up to the wealthy.
Take it up. Exactly. That's what it always has. That's what always redistribution of wealth has been about. Although it's sold to the nummies down at the bottom, they think that they're going to get a piece of it, and then so they say, yeah, this is good. And that's exactly the ploy that I'm talking about. They tell the people one thing, in reality they're doing something quite the opposite. And they wanted it as a means of destroying or at least controlling and minimizing the middle class to prevent more people from moving upward. And they knew that the super rich could always avoid paying taxes because they could afford to pay off politicians to vote for laws that would give them loopholes and ways of avoiding it. And, of course, the tax-exempt foundation was one of those loopholes. All of the great dynasties of the United States, the great wealthy families, preserve their wealth through tax-exempt foundations. And it has the appearance of being a philanthropic operation, but it's not. They control their own wealth through their board of directors and mostly their family members and trusted employees and their corporations and so forth. They control the wealth without technically owning it, but they control it nevertheless. And that's a loophole that the average person in the lower class or the middle class doesn't even have a shot at.
Our founding fathers never wanted an income tax, and they certainly were extremely worried about a central bank. The concept of getting a central bank started at the beginning of the country. Alexander Hamilton and others wanted a central bank. If people who are students of history know that Andrew Jackson basically said he would fight to the last drop of blood in his veins to make sure that there was never a central bank in this country. So the bankers always wanted to get their greedy hands on the United States of America. I'm talking about the international bankers. They always wanted to do it from the beginning of the country. But they managed to do it in the early 1900s. And people need to understand that when they got the Federal Reserve Act passed, and then they got the 16th Amendment ramrodded through, and they created the income tax, and then the IRS, a two-headed monster was set up. Edward, it was a two-headed monster that was started to devour the lifeblood of the American people.
Well, certainly true. You mentioned Andrew Jackson. That was the most interesting part of my research when I realized that this battle that we're facing right now had been fought several times before in the history of our country. And Jackson was, of course, one of the leading historical figures that defeated the third central bank in America. He called them a den of vipers. not too bad.
Yeah,
description.
Sounds biblical to me.
Yeah.
Well, bringing this thing fast forward to 2011, we're in a mess, and our money system, our currency is degrading. There's open talk in the world about replacing the U.S. dollar. Inflation is once again eating away at the resources of the American people. Are these problems the result of allowing the bankers to have control of our financial system?
Yes, they are all a result and a direct result of that. There's no way to rationalize this as a natural force of history or anything like this. It's a result of direct intervention in the free market. It's a result of giving a small group of people, and we call them bankers, give them the monopoly over the creation of a nation's money supply. And it was also a result of making them completely independent of any kind of oversight, any meaningful oversight on the part of the political structure. These people do what they want to do. They don't have to answer to Congress or to the president or anybody else. As a matter of fact, they probably are the ones that, if you really understood all the mechanisms, they're the ones that select the president and determine who gets to go to Congress. It's the other way around. Tremendous power, and this is all traceable to them. And I think once people realize that, they then get really serious about wanting to make some changes, and they start wondering about how effective it really is to write another letter to your congressman and say, "Won't you please follow the Constitution?" And then they realize, heck, their congressmen are part of the problem. And once you understand that the Federal Reserve System is a banking cartel, then you've got the picture pretty clear. Congress acted as little puppets, little boys and girls who did what they were told to do. They passed legislation that gave this banking cartel the police power of the government to regulate our entire economic life.
I mean, it's like deputizing Jesse James and telling him, we want you to go out there and find out who's robbing all these banks.
Well, that's exactly what it is, and it's pretty easy to understand when you realize that the sheriff is Jesse James' brother.
As you're watching these things develop over the last 5-6 years with the economic system cracking up around the world, what is your thinking about the U.S. Federal Reserve and the whole financial system of the world? Is Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve boys, are they in control of this breakup of the world system, or are they breaking up? Are they insolvent? Where's this? How's this playing out?
It's a difficult thing to answer easily, or at least quickly. But the reality is that the central banks of the world all are pretty much operating the same way that the Federal Reserve System is. So we look around the world, and it's just the same everywhere, and these fellows do work together now, as you pointed out, through the Bank of International Settlements and through other groupings, the Meeting of the Seven, the meetings of various countries. They work together. So we're dealing with an international mechanism now. It's not just the United States. You asked the question, are they engineering the breakup? Well, they're certainly engineering everything that's happening, but what we call a breakup, from our perspective, because it's destroying the economies, it's destroying the purchasing power of the average person, it's causing unemployment. We think of that as negative, and we call it a breakup. But from their point of view, they don't really see it necessarily as a breakup. It's more like Kissinger has said on numerous occasions, this is a wonderful opportunity, he said.
Yes, they call it
opportunity to build something good, like New World Order, you know. So these people don't necessarily see it as a breakup, as they see it as a transition and an excuse to create an international system, which would be no different than the ones that are in each nation locally, except now it'll be consolidated through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and it'll be global. So they're kind of excited about it. I think they're looking forward to what we call a breakup.
Yes, their term is creative destruction.
Yes, creative destruction.
Alan Greenspan was a great proponent of creative destruction. Mm-hmm. You remember, I'm sure, my good friend Joan Vion, who passed away last year. And,
yes.
Joan asked Alan Greenspan to his face. I'll tell you what, for a lady that was only about 5 feet tall, she was spunky, and she asked Alan Greenspan to his face. She said, "Are you practicing creative destruction?" And he was speechless. And she pressed on again, and he never would answer her question. She was in one of the meetings in Europe where Greenspan was in the room, and she directly confronted him as a reporter. Are you practicing creative destruction? Greenspan knew that Joan knew what he was doing, but the rest of the reporters there had no idea what she was talking about. But that's what they're doing to us. My guest today, G. Edward Griffin. The book is The Creature from Jekyll Island. It is a classic. You need to read it more than ever to understand what they are doing to you and me right now. RealityZone.com is where you can get it. Thank you, my friend. Glad to have you back on the program again.
Okay, thank you. Next time.
Well, we're out of time for the very last True News program for 2012, and you're almost out of time to present an offering to God in support of True News for all that we've done in 2012 on this last day of the year.